In the sweltering heat of summer 1876, the rolling hills of western Kentucky basked in a deceptive stillness. Tobacco plants stood in orderly rows across the Beaumont estate, their wide leaves curling beneath the sun, exhaling the scent of earth and wealth. For most outsiders, the plantation was a symbol of Southern resilience, an enduring monument to aristocracy and the boundless ambition of the Beaumont bloodline. But for those born and buried under its shadow, the land whispered different stories, ones not spoken aloud. The Beaumont family had ruled these acres since before the war, long before emancipation disrupted the delicate social balance they so carefully curated. With the Confederacy's fall came a quieter desperation. Many plantation families fell into ruin, their fortunes gone with the lives lost on muddy battlefields. But the Beaumonts were different. Somehow, as others bled dry, their wealth endured. Their fields yielded even greater harvests. Their workers, though no longer enslaved by law, remained bound to the estate by debt, by fear, or by something more elusive. At the heart of the estate stood a grand manor, weathered but proud. Wide verandas circled its facade, and tall black shutters framed windows that had seen generations come and go. Inside, the walls held oil portraits of grim-faced ancestors, each staring down the hallways with eyes that seemed to follow visitors as they passed. The family name carried weight. Local bankers lent the Beaumonts credit without hesitation. Local politicians sought their favor. Their influence flowed through the county like the Green River itself, broad, slow-moving, and not easily diverted. But beneath the surface of their prosperity, a quiet unease had always lingered. Farmhands swore they heard things in the fields after dusk, low, inhuman murmurs carried on the wind, strange rustling in rows left unpicked. Horses refused to go near the eastern fields unless forced. Dogs often whimpered and barked at empty space near the tree line, and every few years a worker or two would vanish. Most chalked it up to desertion, to the chaos of a Reconstruction South, to the freedom of movement that came with emancipation. But the Beaumonts said little when asked. Nothing, really. Just a look, or a cold, polite silence that chilled the conversation. This silence, passed down through generations, was an inheritance just as real as the land itself. The elder Beaumonts never spoke of family history outside their circle. There were no public church confessions, no town meetings attended, and certainly no mention of what happened in the Salt Lick woods beyond the fields. What few knew, those old enough to remember or curious enough to pry, was that the Beaumont line began not in the drawing rooms of genteel Charleston, as some claimed, but here, beside a spring that the native Shawnee had long called cursed. According to whispers, the original Beaumont, Rufus, a wiry man from Virginia with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, arrived in 1805, not to farm, but to bury something. Some said it was treasure, others a body. Regardless, shortly after his arrival, the crops grew like wildfire. Tobacco, maize, even strange herbs not native to the region, thrived in ways that defied reason. Rufus built his manor atop a hill overlooking that very spring, and from there the family's wealth took root. What most refused to acknowledge, even to themselves, was the cost. From the earliest days, the plantation required more than just toil and labor. There were disappearances even then, even among the enslaved who had nowhere else to flee. There were fires that started without cause, and dreams that plagued workers who stayed too long. There were years where the river flooded only their fields, and years where nothing grew on neighboring land, while the Beaumonts harvested double. Some believed it was just luck. Others who lived closer spoke of old-world blood rites, of symbols carved into cellar walls, of offerings left at the edge of the tree line during the new moon. A traveling preacher once tried to cleanse the estate with prayer and holy water. He left 3 days later, pale and trembling, and was never seen in the county again. By the time Elijah Beaumont was born in 1851, the rituals, whatever they were, had faded from public knowledge. His father, Jameson, rarely spoke of family history and often sent Elijah away during the harvest season, under the excuse of education in Boston. It was there, in the company of books and reason, that Elijah came to see his family's land as an anachronism, an outdated relic of a bygone age, with its creaking porches and secretive staff. But when news of his father's passing reached him, Elijah returned, drawn not by grief, but by a restless curiosity, a desire to understand the weight he had always carried but never fully acknowledged. Upon arrival, he found the estate largely unchanged, majestic yet subdued. The air seemed thicker, the nights darker than he remembered. Workers spoke less than they used to. The staff avoided eye contact. A new overseer, a man named Grigsby, kept meticulous records but was oddly evasive when asked about recent hires. The fields, while healthy, held a certain stillness, as if they waited for something. Then came the incident. In the span of 1 week, 41 workers vanished without a trace. Their bunks were left undisturbed, tools abandoned mid-task. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks, just absence. Elijah, shaken, turned to the old house for answers, and there, behind a false panel in his father's study, he found the ledger, a leather-bound book filled with names, dates, and something far worse. Patterns, cycles, references to something beneath the eastern field. 41. Always 41. And as the moon waned above the Beaumont estate, the wind began to rise through the tobacco rows again, carrying with it the scent of soil, smoke, and secrets best left buried. The morning they realized the workers were gone began like any other. Humid, slow, thick with the smell of damp tobacco and wet soil. The air, though only half lit by the dawn, carried a weight that Elijah Beaumont could not shake. He had risen early, as was becoming habit since his return, to inspect the fields and get a clearer understanding of what the plantation had become under his father's final years. Grigsby, the overseer, met him near the stables with his usual blunt nod and a clipboard tucked under one arm. Elijah had expected to discuss crop yields, the condition of the drying barns, perhaps the slow decline in available labor that had troubled the region since emancipation. Instead, Grigsby's first words froze the day. "They're gone. All of them." Elijah stared at him, uncertain if he had heard correctly. "Gone?" Grigsby gestured toward the lower bunkhouses. "The new hands. The ones we brought on last month. Vanished sometime in the night." Elijah's brows furrowed. "All 41? "Aye, every last one." The words rang oddly in Elijah's ears. It was not only the scale of the disappearance, 41 men missing without so much as a noise, but the number itself. It stirred something deep and unspoken within him, as if it had been whispered in a half-forgotten dream. He pushed the thought aside and followed Grigsby down to the workers' quarters. The scene was unsettling in its absence of disturbance. The bunkhouse doors stood open. Inside, everything remained neatly arranged, bedrolls still tucked, boots aligned beside straw mats, clothes hanging from nails driven into support beams. A pan of cold beans sat atop a stone hearth, untouched. Tools rested by the door. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken planks. The silence was total, as if the very memory of those men had been erased overnight. By noon, the word had spread. The remaining staff, house servants, a few elderly pickers, 2 freedmen who worked the drying barn, gathered in hushed groups beneath the oaks, murmuring to one another. Some crossed themselves, others muttered warnings about the old ground. One woman, old Sarah Beth, who had worked for the Beaumonts since before Elijah was born, would not speak at all. She simply stared eastward toward the far field by the edge of the woods. Elijah, though rational by upbringing, felt unease settling over him like a second skin. In Boston, he would have called this superstition. A mass walkout, perhaps. Maybe the men were lured away by a better offer. But that logic unraveled quickly. The missing men were a mix of desperate laborers, freedmen, Irish migrants, and two families of Appalachian origin, all recently hired after a flood had swept through the region in spring. None of them had kin nearby. They came with the promise of wages and food, both rare commodities in rural Kentucky, and had every reason to stay. No one left personal belongings behind like this. No one simply walked into the night with nothing. Still, Elijah sent Grigsby and two riders out in different directions, hoping they might find traces, footprints, a wagon trail, anything. They found nothing. By evening, he summoned the county sheriff. Sheriff Emmett Hale was not a man given to theatricality. He was short, with a belly like a stone barrel, and a long mustache that dipped when he frowned, which was often. Upon his arrival, he inspected the bunkhouses, asked a few pointed questions, then stared at Elijah for a long, quiet moment. "You got enemies, Beaumont?" "Not to my knowledge," Elijah replied. "You got debt?" "No." "Then why would 41 men walk off your land without shoes on their feet and not one of them head into town for a drink or a loaf of bread?" "I don't know," Elijah said. The sheriff pursed his lips. "You know what people are saying?" Elijah did. Whispers had begun already, not just about the missing men, but about the land, the past, the family. Some claimed it was the price of wealth paid in blood. Others blamed the woods east of the fields, Salt Lick Hollow, a dense, almost primeval grove of trees where even deer rarely wandered. For generations, locals had told stories about that place. Lights seen at night, chants that rose with the fog. Native spirits, some claimed. Demonic relics, said others. Hale stayed the night, posting one of his deputies at the edge of the eastern fields. The man quit by morning, pale as ash, refusing to speak about what he heard. He left his badge on the kitchen table and rode out before breakfast. The investigation, such as it was, stalled. There were no leads, no sightings, no demands for ransom. Hale filed a report with the county court, but nothing came of it. No search parties were organized. No newspapers ran the story. It simply faded into the humid Kentucky air like smoke after a storm. Elijah, meanwhile, began noticing other oddities. In the fields near the eastern slope, some of the tobacco leaves had curled and blackened, though no rot or blight was visible. Birds avoided those rows entirely. Workers who remained refused to pick there, even when threatened with dismissal. They said the ground felt hollow beneath their feet. They said they heard whispers when they bent to harvest. And always there was that number, 41. It wasn't just the number of vanished workers. It appeared again and again, scratched into old beams in the drying barn, etched into the underside of a rusted plow marked in ash on the floor of the smokehouse. Elijah even found it in one of his father's journals, a circle of symbols around the number, repeated over decades, always at 13-year intervals, always beginning in midsummer. Something ancient was buried in that soil, not just bones or secrets, but intention. And whatever pact had been made to keep the Beaumont fields fertile, for so long Elijah was beginning to suspect it had come due again. This time, the cost had been 41 souls. They called it the Salt Lick Curse. Most folks in the nearby town of Harlan's Fork only muttered the name after a few whiskeys, lowering their voices like it might hear them through the walls. It wasn't written about in newspapers or included in Sunday sermons, but everyone knew the story, everyone native to the land at least. The Beaumont Plantation sat on ground soaked not just in labor and sweat, but in something older, something hungry. And in 1876, when the 41 workers disappeared, it wasn't long before the old stories started to crawl their way back into conversation. Long before the Beaumonts ever built their grand estate, long before white men first laid claim to the tobacco-rich hills, there was a spring, Salt Lick Spring, a slow trickling rise from deep underground that tasted of minerals and metal. The Shawnee and other native tribes considered the place sacred, not in the holy sense, but in the cautionary one. They didn't drink from it. They didn't hunt near it. They never camped nearby. The area was marked by stacked stones and crude carvings meant to keep people away. It was said that beneath the spring was something that breathed, something that didn't forget trespass. When Rufus Beaumont arrived in the early 1800s and built his estate within sight of the spring, the locals were already gone, driven out or killed off, their warnings left to rot. Rufus either didn't believe the tales or, more troubling, believed in them too much. That was the question that lingered for generations. Did he stumble onto something by accident, or was he drawn here with intent? There were no clear records of his activities in those first years, no journals, no visitors. Just silence, broken only by reports of strange gatherings at night and the sudden deaths of livestock across the surrounding farms. The land around the spring, what would later be the eastern fields of the plantation, was avoided even by enslaved workers. When they were forced to till the soil there, they did so quickly, eyes down, never staying past sundown. Some ran off rather than be assigned to the eastern plots. Those who remained told whispered tales of the hollow ground where footsteps echoed strangely and the soil stayed damp even in drought. They said sometimes, at dusk, you could see figures standing at the edge of the woods, figures that didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. As decades passed, the plantation grew, and with it, the tales. Even as slavery was abolished and new workers arrived, the stories never stopped. Older field hands would warn the younger ones to avoid Salt Lick Spring. They would mark certain rows in the field as cursed. When the wind blew from the east, they said, you should pray and keep your head down. Some carried tokens or made chalk marks near their cabins to ward off whatever lingered there. After the Civil War, with the South in chaos and the economy in pieces, the Beaumonts thrived in a way that defied reason. Their crops grew despite failing soil elsewhere. Their fields remained untouched by blight, flood, or storm. Other plantations burned or fell into debt. The Beaumont estate remained pristine, profitable even, and still people went missing. It was easy to explain away in the confusion of Reconstruction. Freedmen left jobs without notice. Immigrants moved in search of better pay. There was no shortage of excuses, but not to those who had lived here long enough. They remembered names, they remembered numbers, and they remembered what it always added up to, 41. The cycle had gone on for generations, like clockwork. Every 13 years during the late summer, workers would vanish, always in multiples. Never a body found, never a weapon. It wasn't war, it wasn't robbery, and yet the pattern remained as consistent as rainfall. 41 souls, swallowed by the fields like an offering, as if something had to be fed. By 1876, the whispers of the Salt Lick curse had grown too loud to ignore, especially after Elijah Beaumont returned home and began to ask questions. He didn't believe the stories, not at first. Educated in Boston, trained to value logic and evidence, he dismissed the tales as superstition. But as he read through the plantation records and interviewed the older workers, those who hadn't fled, he couldn't ignore the weight of it all. the fear in their eyes, the way their voices dropped when they said Salt Lick, the hesitation, the rituals, the small offering some still left on their porches. One man, Amos, who had worked on the estate since boyhood, told Elijah something that stuck with him. "It ain't just a curse," he said, eyes cloudy with age. "It's a deal. Done long before your time, long before mine. Something buried down in that spring, and your kin made a promise to it. Blood for bounty. You see all this?" He gestured at the flourishing fields, the solid barns, the fat livestock. "That don't come free." Elijah didn't want to believe it, but then came the dreams, at first subtle, just shadows at the edge of vision, the sound of breathing that wasn't his. But they grew darker. In one he stood alone in the eastern field, rows of tobacco stretching endlessly, and the ground beneath him began to pulse like a living thing. In another he saw his ancestors standing in a circle, faces hidden by carved wooden masks, blood on their hands, the spring bubbling behind them like a mouth trying to speak. Then the 41 disappeared, just like before. No signs, no warnings, gone in a single night. Panic spread. Elijah tried to send riders to nearby towns, but storms rose from nowhere and blocked the roads. The remaining workers refused to go near the eastern fields. Some fled outright. And always that number hung in the air like smoke. 41. Again. At the center of it all was Salt Lick Spring, still trickling, still quiet, but never truly still. Elijah finally stood before it one moonless night, lantern in hand, heart pounding like a drum. The water shimmered darkly, casting strange reflections. Beneath the surface he saw movement. Not fish, not roots. Something deeper, something vast, something old. He thought of the ledger he'd found, of the symbols scrawled beside each group of disappearances, of the repeated phrase in Latin, written in his father's hand, "Pactum servandum," estimated, the pact must be kept. And with that came understanding. Not belief in folklore, not surrender to madness, but an acknowledgement of the truth that lived in the bones of this land. The Beaumonts had inherited more than wealth. They had inherited obligation, debt, a deal forged long before Elijah's time and not yet paid in full. The wind rose from the east, thick with the scent of tobacco and damp earth, and the trees bent as if bowing. The spring gurgled once and then fell silent. The study smelled of old pipe smoke, varnish, and dust, an atmosphere thick with memory where the air itself seemed reluctant to stir. Elijah Beaumont hadn't set foot in this room since he was 16, the last time he returned for Christmas, before his father sent him back to Boston with barely a handshake. Now, at 25, he stood where his father once sat, behind a broad mahogany desk worn smooth at the edges. The shutters had been closed, leaving the room dim, lit only by the fractured glow of morning sneaking through the slats. Piles of correspondence lay unopened. A gold pocket watch, still ticking, rested on top of a stack of worn maps, as though Jameson Beaumont might return at any moment to resume his meticulous habits. But he wouldn't. He was buried less than a mile away in the family plot, beneath a granite headstone Elijah hadn't yet visited. The funeral had been rushed, quiet, no town procession, just a note from the lawyer and a hurried burial. Elijah's hand hovered over the desk drawer, the one he remembered his father locking every evening with quiet precision. The brass key had been left in the top drawer of the armoire, deliberately or perhaps carelessly, though Jameson Beaumont was never careless. With a firm twist, the lock clicked open. The drawer held a bundle of receipts, dried ink pens, a leather-bound flask, and something far older, a ledger, thick with age, its spine cracked, and its corners discolored. He lifted it gently. The leather was warm, oddly pliable, as if it had absorbed generations of handling. There was no title on the cover, only a symbol etched into the surface. A circle intersected by 4 points, almost like a compass, but older, rougher. He sat and opened it to the first page. Names. Dozens of them, each written in a precise, unwavering hand. Dates beside each one. The earliest entry was from 1805, the same year Rufus Beaumont had supposedly founded the plantation. Next to each name, a symbol, sometimes a simple mark, like a tally, and other times more elaborate. Spirals, triangles, what looked like runes or sigils. Elijah flipped forward, trying to make sense of the pattern, but the only thing immediately clear was the number, 41. Repeated again and again, every 13 years. 41 names listed beside each of those years. The realization crept into his spine like a draft. These weren't just records of laborers, these were disappearances, entries, he now understood, of those taken. Hired hands, drifters, freedmen, immigrants, people who would not be missed by the world beyond these states' borders. Each name meticulously recorded by someone in his bloodline, including, he feared, his father. As he turned the pages, the handwriting changed slightly with each generation, but the pattern held. Every 13 years, always 41. He came upon the most recent entry, 1870, and saw a name he recognized, Joseph Pritchard, a quiet field worker who used to let Elijah ride beside him on the mule cart. Next to Joseph's name was a mark, a vertical line with 2 dots above it. Elijah didn't know what it meant, but it chilled him. Joseph had vanished when Elijah was just a boy. He'd asked about him once, and been told the man had taken to the road. The tone in his father's voice had been final. He turned the page, expecting more records, but instead he found a folded piece of parchment tucked into the seam. It was stiff and yellowed, with a diagram drawn in rust-colored ink. Not ink, something thicker. Blood, maybe. Elijah's breath hitched. The diagram showed the plantation layout with disturbing specificity. The manor, the slave quarters, long since converted to worker lodges, the curing barns, the storage sheds, and most notably, a circle etched in the eastern fields. He'd walked that land dozens of times, but had never seen any such circle. There was writing scrawled beneath the diagram. Not English, Latin maybe, or something older. He didn't recognize the script, but the last line was in plain letters, shaky and uneven. Beneath the field, the pact holds. Blood for bounty. 41 for 13. Do not break the cycle. Elijah sat back in the creaking chair, his hand gripping the edges of the desk. He stared down at the ledger, heart thudding, as realization bloomed fully in his mind. This was no simple family record. This was a grim tally of sacrifices, a covenant, perhaps, honored through generations of silence. His father had known, and his father before him. And now, with Jameson dead, it was Elijah's turn to know. He closed the book and leaned forward, head in his hands. He could hear the faint ticking of the pocket watch again, like a countdown. He understood now why he had always been sent away at certain times of year, always around harvest. Why the workers changed. Why the eastern field was sometimes left untouched despite its fertility. The ledger explained the inexplicable. The persistent prosperity of the Beaumonts when others failed, the way storms skirted their land and how their harvest never failed, because they were never simply harvests of crops. They were harvests of people. The revelation struck with a sickening clarity. The plantation's success wasn't born of hard work or innovation. It was born of blood, sealed in secrecy, bound to some ancient bargain. He stood abruptly, shoving the ledger back into the drawer. He couldn't look at it any longer, not now, not without vomiting. A soft knock came at the study door. He turned, startled. It was Grigsby, the overseer, a tall man with a hollow gaze and hands that rarely seemed to stop moving. "Mr. Beaumont," he said quietly, "there's a matter you ought to see. Something out by the east field." Elijah's throat tightened. "Another worker?" he asked, dreading the answer. Grigsby hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir. Not this time. It's a door." "A door?" "In the ground, like a trap door. Covered in bramble. Storm pushed some of it loose last night." Elijah didn't speak. He just nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the drawer. The cycle was not done. The year was 1876, 6 years past the last entry. Was that why 41 had vanished so recently? Had the cycle shifted, or had his father tried to alter it and failed? One thing was certain now: the missing men were not gone in ignorance. They were taken, perhaps given. And beneath the tobacco, beneath the carefully manicured rows of green, something waited. Something kept fed and patient for generations, and whatever pact had been made long ago, it still stood. For now. The eastern field had always been different. Even as a child, Elijah Beaumont sensed something odd about the way the wind moved through the tobacco rows there. Slower, heavier, as though the air itself carried weight. Horses would hesitate when approaching it. Older workers, those who'd been on the land long before Elijah was born, always found reasons to steer clear. The field was fertile, yes, perhaps too fertile. No matter the weather, no matter the blight or drought that plagued neighboring farms, the tobacco in the eastern section thrived with unnatural vigor. After the disappearance of the 41 workers, Elijah couldn't sleep. Not from guilt, though he felt that too, but from a growing sense that the answers he needed were closer than he wished. The old ledger left behind by his father haunted him with its cryptic notations, symbols drawn in charcoal, lists of names, and an unmistakable pattern. Every 13 years, 41 laborers hired and gone without explanation. The last recorded date before 1876 matched an earlier tragedy the family had quietly erased from memory. A barn collapse that supposedly killed several field hands. But there had been no burial records, no compensation to the families, nothing but silence. Elijah's only ally on the plantation was Isaac Turner, a former field hand turned groundskeeper who had served the Beaumonts since Elijah was a boy. He was older now, his hands calloused, eyes sharp with suspicion, but his loyalty had always been to Elijah's mother, a woman who had died young, and whose portrait now gathered dust above the cold hearth. Isaac had known something was wrong the moment the disappearances began. He'd seen it before. He'd buried the guilt deep in his bones, but now, with the boy he once watched grow returning as master of the house, the silence between them cracked. "You're asking questions that your father never dared to answer," Isaac warned one evening, his voice low, his gaze fixed beyond the porch where the sky had begun to darken. "Then maybe that's why he died without peace," Elijah replied, holding the ledger tight in his hand. Isaac finally nodded, slow and reluctant. "There's a place you need to see. But you best be sure you want to see it." Late that night, the two men crossed the field with lanterns in hand, their boots sinking into soil that felt loamy and damp, despite the lack of rain. The air grew colder with every step toward the farthest edge, where the land sloped down into a thicket near the old Salt Lick woods. Isaac led Elijah past a withered tree stump, barely visible now, but once a towering cedar that slaves used as a meeting point in secret. He brushed aside a thick mat of vines and knelt beside a rock no one would give a second glance, unless they knew what they were looking for. Beneath the rock, buried in the clay, was an iron ring. Isaac hesitated, then gave it a firm tug. The earth groaned. A square panel of rotted wood lifted slowly, revealing a shaft descending into pitch blackness. The smell hit Elijah first. Dank, metallic, and old. Not rot exactly. More like a place that hadn't breathed fresh air in 100 years. They descended by rope ladder, the stone walls slick with moisture. The further they went, the more the temperature dropped, and the silence grew thick, oppressive. At the base of the shaft, they landed in a narrow tunnel carved by hand, torch-scorched in places, the walls marked with strange symbols matching those in the ledger. Elijah ran his fingers across them, realizing they weren't etched with tools. They were burned into the stone. They moved deeper, lanterns casting shadows along uneven walls. The tunnel widened into a cavernous space that opened suddenly like stepping through a veil. What lay beyond defied logic. The chamber was vast, dozens of feet across and filled with crude stone altars, skeletal remains, and bones arranged in ritualistic circles. The ceiling curved high above them, dotted with stalactites that glistened like teeth. At the center, a circular platform marked with the number 41, repeated over and over in charcoal, chalk, and dried blood. The smell was stronger here. The air buzzed faintly, though there was no wind. Elijah moved slowly through the chamber, horror mounting with each step. Bones, some animal, many human, lined the floor in deliberate patterns. Objects lay among them, rusted tools, rosaries, cloth satchels with initials stitched into the leather, even a few brittle tobacco leaves bound in twine. Offerings, he realized. These were not just victims. They were part of something older, something kept alive. "It was your great-grandfather who built this place," Isaac said quietly, "and his father before him who made the deal." "What kind of deal?" Elijah asked, though he already feared the answer. Isaac gestured to the markings. "They say the land here was cursed, but that's not true. It was never cursed. It was fed. There's something under us, beneath the salt lick. And your family fed it. Every 13 years, 41 lives, in exchange for good harvests, good health, and protection from war and ruin." Elijah shook his head. "That's insanity." Isaac looked at him, sadness heavy in his eyes. "Then why does everything in that book match what's down here?" He had no answer. Only the taste of bile rising in his throat and the sound of his pulse thundering in his ears. Elijah's world was unraveling. Each thread of family honor and legacy pulled apart to reveal this, the real foundation of their fortune, the hidden machinery of prosperity soaked in blood. He knelt beside one of the skeletons and noticed a necklace, simple, silver, marked with the initials RF. He recognized the name from the ledger, Rachel Furlow, hired 3 weeks before the vanishings, a mother of 2, gone without a trace. "They brought them here?" he asked, voice shaking. Isaac nodded. "Drugged, most likely. Quietly. They were always careful. The overseers knew what to do." The silence that followed was unbearable. Elijah stood, rage and shame surging together, and turned toward the shaft. "Seal it," he said. "Seal it forever." As he climbed, he realized this chamber wasn't just a secret, it was a decision, one made by each generation, and now it was his. Above ground, the wind blew gently across the eastern field as though it too were waiting to see what he'd do next. Elijah Beaumont stood in the center of his father's old study, the flickering oil lamp casting long shadows across the bookshelves and dust-choked curtains. The ledger lay open on the desk in front of him, its leather cracked with age, its pages warped and stained. It had taken weeks to decipher the coded entries, and now that the truth stood plain before him, it felt heavier than the house itself. He read the names again, 41. Every 13 years, a list. Workers. always listed by initials or symbols, never full names. The final column beside each entry marked only by a date. No exit record, no follow-up, just a number, a toll. The latest date matched the week the laborers vanished. It was not drought, disease, or desertion. It was something far older, something entwined with the very bones of the land. He had tried to convince himself the discoveries in the catacombs below the eastern field. Narrow stone corridors filled with skeletal remains, markings burned into rock, soot-lined altars, were relics of the past, of forgotten rituals. But the air down there hadn't felt abandoned. It had felt watching, waiting. The former plantation worker who helped him find the shaft, an elderly man named Wiley, refused to return. "You shouldn't have gone down there, Mr. Beaumont," Wiley had said, eyes wide and voice trembling. "There's no praying thing down there. It's not of God, and it doesn't care who carries your name." Elijah couldn't sleep. At night he heard the same rustling in the fields that had haunted his dreams since childhood, but now it had a rhythm to it, like breath. Sometimes he'd glimpse figures near the edge of the tree line, still tall, too tall. Once, when he followed them with a lantern, the light flickered and snuffed itself out. By the time he relit it, the figure was gone, leaving only a strange pattern of hoofprints in the soil that didn't belong to any horse he knew. The ledger contained more than names. Tucked in the back was a folded map, old and brittle, marked with circles drawn in red ink. One of them corresponded exactly to the foundation beneath the eastern field. Another, closer to the manor, had already been obscured by ivy and stone. Elijah began to understand why his father had never let the family venture beyond certain boundaries on the property. The borders weren't about land ownership, they were containment. And now containment had failed. As the days passed, Elijah noticed subtle changes. The air on the estate grew heavier. A fog clung to the fields even in the heat of noon. Birds had stopped nesting near the tobacco rows, and the insects that usually thrived in the Kentucky summer had gone silent. Worse were the dreams. Every night he saw the same vision, standing at the edge of the eastern field as a procession emerged from the rows, men, women, children, each with empty eyes and mouths stitched shut. They formed a circle around him. In the center stood a figure draped in old burlap and tobacco leaves, its face obscured by a mask of bone and bark. It raised one hand, fingers blackened like charred wood, and pointed at him. Then the field would crack open beneath his feet. He'd wake with soil under his fingernails. There was no more pretending. The Beaumont legacy wasn't just about land or money. It was about this: a bargain struck long ago to protect the family's prosperity in exchange for blood. Rufus Beaumont had made the deal. Jameson Beaumont had maintained it, and now Elijah stood at the crossroads. He could continue the silence, allow the story to be rewritten again, let the next cycle claim its next 41. No one outside the estate had pushed too hard for answers. The authorities had accepted the theory of mass desertion. The townfolk had learned over generations that questions about the Beaumonts led only to doors that didn't open. But Elijah had seen the bones, had touched the markings with his own hands, had read the final entry in the ledger, written in his father's trembling script. "He comes again. I have no more strength. Elijah must choose." He didn't know what he was, but he knew it wasn't a god any church would name. The final straw came one night, a week after the disappearances. Elijah found a boy wandering near the eastern fence line, no older than 10, one of the few remaining workers' children. The boy had dirt in his mouth, his eyes glazed. When Elijah knelt to help him, the child whispered, "The rows are opening again. They're hungry." By morning, the boy was gone. Elijah called together what remained of the household staff and offered them money to leave. Now, before the next nightfall. Some argued. Others fled immediately. He gave Wiley the deeds to a small property in town and begged him to go, to tell some poem, to keep the memory of what had happened alive. Wiley promised, but Elijah doubted anyone would believe the old man's stories. They never had before. He gathered what supplies he could, salt, kerosene, the family's last remaining revolver, and made his way to the shaft beneath the field. The wind blew against him as he walked, though the night was still. The stars were gone, and the moon hung low, bloated and red like a dying eye. The stone door at the bottom of the shaft was already open. He stepped inside. There was no grand reckoning, no thunder or screams, only silence, and the sense of something immense shifting just beyond sight. The tunnel accepted him. The ledger he had brought trembled in his hand as if caught in a breeze from below. What happened next would never be recorded. Some say the tobacco fields grew wild that year, leaves thick as blankets and dark as ink. Others claim the Beaumont Manor stood empty for decades, its windows always lit, despite no one living inside. The official record listed Elijah Beaumont as missing, last seen walking into his family's fields under a stormless sky. No one ever took over the estate, and no one ever found the next 41. Thanks for watching. If eerie history, dark folklore, and forgotten horrors are your kind of story, subscribe to Bloodlore, where every legend bleeds truth. New tales drop weekly. Don't miss what's buried beneath.